I'm your host, Dr. Ben Habib, lecturer in international relations at Trobe University. North Korea's been in the news a lot in 2017 because of nuclear politics. But there's a lot more going on than just missiles and bombs on the Korean peninsula. Today, we're joined by Dr. Robert Winstanley-Chesters, who's a research fellow at Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific, and also author of the book Environment, Politics and Ideology in North Korea, Landscape as a Political Project, published by Lexington Press. Robert, nuclear politics tends to suck up all the oxygen in policy debates and public perceptions around North Korea. Why should we consider the environment as a key part of our understanding of the DPRK?
Nuclear politics at the moment across the Pacific and in relation to North Korea has been so hot a topic that it has virtually driven out all other aspects of North Korean studies. Not just in terms of North Korea's nuclear capacity, but North Korea's military capacity and its security threat, people's understanding of it as a security threat, and its sort of status as a general aberration in world politics. I also think the concern about nuclear politics is a sign of the current theatre and drama of politics across the world, but it's also a sign of where the money is in Korean studies. I think people have a interestingly millenarian attitude towards North Korea, thinking that North Korea itself has a very millenarian attitude. And essentially, that's because in North Korea they're interested in researching or knowing about is the North Korea that isn't going to be there for very long, or the North Korea that will be there in the future, the North Korea of their dreams or their imagination. People really aren't interested in the minutiae or the nitty-gritty of other things that happen in North Korea. Unlike most other countries on the planet, this is not just a fact because North Korea is an autocracy. I think you have to look at research done in the 1960s and 70s by American researchers and by researchers funded by the CIA on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was as much of a nuclear threat to the United States in the 1960s as North Korea is today, and much, much more of a nuclear threat. But American scholars and scholars around the world found the time to research all aspects of Soviet culture and the functionality of Soviet governance. If you look at the Problems of Communism journal or the Soviet Studies journals, you'll see there are sections on not just on Soviet nuclear capacity, but on Soviet mathematics, on Soviet theater, on Soviet environmental matters. And I think it's a real sign of the reductiveness of our media and academic culture that sort of research, people aren't interested in it anymore, and universities and government institutions are not interested in doing it anymore. Especially because if you think about the fact that a nuclear exchange involving North Korea would be of an environmental crisis, unlike many other environmental crises in the world at the moment. The environmental destruction and damage created by that would be extraordinary. I mean, that isn't my reason for researching North Korean environmental policy. I think that we make very bad policy about North Korea, and the lack of understanding. Sometimes I wonder how much there is to understand, and we overcomplicate things with relation to North Korea. But I think some understanding of the institutional functionality and interests of North Korea would help make better policy. And it's a shame that that doesn't happen. I also think that some of the few instances in which North Korea has really engaged with external international partners and treaties and organizations has been on environmental matters. So North Korea is very concerned about conservation, primarily because it wants resources to exist in the future, because it needs them to, and it needs them to be cheap. So conservation is very important. It also plays a role in the lubrication of North Korea's relationship with the wider world and its status in international organizations. So environmental politics is really important to North Korea. Issues relating to forestry management, bird life, the sea, biodiversity, climate change have been some of the things that North Korea has really tried to make a coherent engagement with within the international context. So I think the approach of North Korea to the environment tells us a great deal about North Korean priorities and the way that it would like to be seen in the world community. And it also tells us a lot about the functionality of certain institutions in North Korea and the processes of government decision-making. I think it's a terrible shame that environmental policy in relation to North Korea is crowded out of the arena of public interest or academic or government interest, much in the same way that a lot of other things about North Korea are crowded out in favor of the current nuclear politics.
Well, let's put environmental analysis back into the mix. In your 2014 book, Environment, Politics and Ideology in North Korea, you explored North Korea's environmental history in a great deal of detail, and it's a great book. I'm fortunate to read it. What were your key observations from this work?
I suppose North Korea has always been interested in environmental matters, and that environmental concerns are deeply connected with its developmental history. This is not to say that North Korea has ever been particularly successful at maintaining environmental equilibrium in its own territory, but it's always a matter of concern, and that concern focuses around the utility of natural resources for North Korean development. So it is important to have a lot of trees if you're going to use a lot of wood. It's important to have a lot of fish if you need to catch a lot of fish. North Korea has always been a very low input, high output sort of developmental agenda. Even when it was gaining Soviet support and support from other places in the communist world before 1992, always required resources to be as cheap as possible. Doubly true after 1992. It's very important to be able to make use of the resource that you have and that you don't have to pay someone else for. Therefore, it's important to have a lot of trees, to have good soil, or to have a high population of fish. Obviously, in North Korea's case, North Korea went down a chemicalized process of agriculture, so North Korea's relationship with soil is one of acute crisis. So, after 1992, with the collapse of the world communist economy and the inability of North Korea to buy fertilizer on the world market, North Korea was left with a soil that was essentially dead. And so North Korea has had to develop a lot of organic agriculture to put nutrients back into the soil to enable some agricultural production to continue. Also, interestingly, North Korean relationships with the environment, with development, tells you a lot about a particular aspect of North Korean politics, which I don't think is particularly focused on, and that is its capacity for critique. So, if you spend a lot of time, like I did, unfortunately for me, reading the 47 volumes of Kim Il-sung's works, in which Kim Il-sung recounts all of the apparently amazing things he did, and which sort of is the historiography of North Korea. He doesn't just focus on military aspects or the success of the guerrilla campaigns or anything like that in the 1930s. He also focuses very specifically on developmental and environmental projects, such as forests, agriculture, that sort of thing. And I think what's really astonishing, if you actually sit back and read those things, is the way that Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, to a lesser extent, in the texts and the histories of North Korea, every couple of years, constantly sort of give very detailed and sort of direction about what to do on particular environmental matters, and nobody ever follows him. So nobody ever actually does what they're supposed to. So 2 or 3 years later, Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il will come back to the place where he gave the instruction, and nothing will have happened. The local party committee will have failed on every account. Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il will criticize the environmental organizations of that particular area and give them some new instructions. So this constant level of critique suggests that, nothing good environmentally ever happened in North Korea. I'm not quite sure what the truth of that is, but it's an extraordinary sense of internal critique within its own developmental and environmental sectors, and it's something that really people don't pick up on. And I think that's something you don't get in other autocratic regimes. So if you think about the works of Stalin, Enver Hoxha in Albania, or like Erich Honecker in East Germany, all of whom published voluminous amounts of work and appeared to know absolutely everything about development in their particular national sense, their books and their texts aren't replete with criticisms of their own developmental institutions. And so I think that's something very interesting. And that's one of the primary lessons for anyone reading the environmental history of North Korea, is the internal critique and the interesting sort of flexibility of that in relation to its institutions.
One of the first treatises that was published by Kim Jong-un in his official publications was a statement on land management back in 2012. How has thoughts on land management under Kim Jong-un evolved from his predecessors?
One thing to also note, and in relation to what I just said, is that often the things that the three Kims say about various aspects of development are actually the same things over and over and over again, even though they are slightly adjusted to account for the fact that, like, government institutions, regional party committees don't seem to pay ever attention. So Kim Jong-un's statement on land administration, which is pretty extraordinary from a 29-year-old man who was supposedly interested in basketball at the time, Kim Jong-un's statement is fairly similar to a statement that his grandfather might have made. If I remember it rightly, he has more focus on organic agriculture than his father might, less chemicalized, less industrial agricultural processes. But I think it's interesting to suggest that it is important for Kim Jong-un as the North Korean leader to express a capability and an interest, even though he may only be 29 at the time. I think he's now 31 or 32. We're not quite sure about exactly how old Kim Jong-un is. It is important for North Korean governmentality that he should express an interest in the environment and a capability when it comes to land management, which equates and connects to the historical memory of his grandfather, who also was very concerned about land management for environmental themes. North Korea is actually quite a small country. There's always been a utopian element, obviously, to North Korea, that it's building a socialist revolution, or the socialist revolution has already happened. But what would be the best thing about a socialist revolution would be to actually create actual socialist landscape. One of the ways North Korea did that in the early years was to transform and reconfigure an agricultural and developmental landscape left over from the Japanese colonial period into a more authentically Korean landscape, a less capitalist landscape, a socialist landscape. So by engaging with land management and environmental matters, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un are building a authentically North Korean environmental space. That authenticity and that sort of desire to create a new terrain, a new revolutionary terrain, if you like, echoes down into all sorts of environmental themes in North Korea's history.
Well, these practices demonstrate an extreme anthropocentric interpretation of the human relationship with the natural environment. How have you seen this anthropocentrism manifest in North Korea's development practice since that time? How has it evolved?
Well, I'm not entirely sure it's ever really evolved that much. I think sometimes people overplay the content of North Korean ideology because, just like its developmental process, North Korean ideology is really an ideology of doing as opposed to thinking. And its flexibility is in its non-definition. So North Korean ideology has very few real defining points because the most important thing about it is its flexibility to be whatever you need it to be at any point in time. If you need Juche to be agriculture, which is entirely chemicalized, great. If you need Juche to be organic agriculture, also great. If you need Juche to be surviving a famine, fantastic, so it can be all of these things. So one of the few principles, and there are probably 4 or 5 principles about Juche, is the notion of man being the master of all things. So a sort of very positivistic, optimistic approach to development. That essentially means that North Korea can achieve anything, even with its small agricultural space and lack of resource. I mean, North Korea is not lacking in resources, but it's a finite resource. I noticed this. I mean, people always talk about particular moments when North Korean institutions met external institutions after 1992 for the first time, and how they were demonstrative of like a particularly North Korean way of thinking. So normally people talk about the World Bank explaining interest to the finance ministry, but I think about it when the FAO explained marine conservation to North Korea's Ministry of Fisheries. And North Korea's fisheries minister, apparently on learning the theory about fishing conservation as post-maximum sustainable yield, which we'll probably get into, it's like, oh, brilliant. Conservation of fish. That means that we have some species of fish which are small in population and useless, and we could replace those with lots of fish that could be useful and appropriate. So you can transform and transfigure an entire population of an ecosystem to fit the needs of a revolutionary man. And so I'm not really sure that it's ever evolved. I mean, it's interesting the way that conservation has connected with developmental policy, but it's a way that conservation connected to development policy, similar to the way that the United States envisioned the conservation of fish stocks prior to the Second World War, in the sense that we need to conserve them so that there are lots to get. We don't need to conserve them for the sake of interesting biodiversity or for the species' sake. They just need to be there for us. So I think there are interesting parallels in the development of that with previous sort of connections to industrial agricultural policy, even in the capitalist world of the first half of the 20th century.
You've done work on the role of topography in North Korean political narratives, and this is fascinating work. In particular, how the culturally significant Paektusan Changbaishan mountain volcanic lake is mobilized as a legitimating symbol in the personality cult surrounding the Kim family. Can you tell us more about the significance of topography in North Korea's official narratives?
The Changbaishan Paektusan mountain example is fascinating because obviously Paektusan is important on both sides of the DMZ. When you take the Seoul Metro and you get off at City Hall Station, I would suggest if you go down the City Star Mall shopping precinct, you'll notice there are vitrines on either side of the corridor with little scale models of Paektusan in. So incorporating, rematerializing Paektusan into this sort of like modern urban topography of Seoul. And that's because Paektusan in particular connects to a much older tradition in Korean culture, which is in itself a little reimagined in the present and was perhaps overdone in the past, which is deriving from a notion of Korean geomancy, which is called the Paektutegan, the notion that Korea is connected by a chain of mountains along which particular key energy, sacred energy flows. And Paektu is the node of connection between other more ancient energy spots in China, like Mount Mutai, to the Korean Peninsula. So the energy arrives on the Korean Peninsula at Paektusan and flows down through all of the mountain ranges, and in eddies and pools around the nation connects at these places which are famous for Sanshin, or mountain gods, and Sinchon, where sort of mountain spirits. Obviously, North Korea is an atheist state, but it doesn't forget that folk memory and the vitality of past Korean geomancy. So it is really important for Paektusan to still be important in North Korea. And it's super vital for Kim Jong-il to have been born in the cabin, which he wasn't probably, and for Kim Il-sung to have fought in the guerrilla campaigns with his first wife, Kim Jong-suk, around the mountain, which sort of happens sometimes, but on very few occasions. But these sort of guerrilla struggle narrative of the 1930s is sort of reprojected onto Paektusan, this important sort of connection to past energy from Korean culture. So Paektusan itself becomes like a vital battlefield, even though it wasn't really a battlefield. Just like some Korean Genesis myths have the universe emerging from the lake on the top of the mountain, so North Korea emerges essentially from the slopes, or the concept of North Korea, because this is read backwards in history, because at the time in the 1930s when Kim Il-sung and his small band of communist guerrillas were fighting in this area, they weren't fighting for a North Korea, they were fighting for a unified Korea. So like North Korea essentially, and this is something that people don't make enough of, really only ever happened by accident. Nobody was attempting to create a North Korea, but it's read back in North Korean historiography that this mountain is like the birthplace of North Korea, and the birthplace and the energy deriving from it for the authority of the current leadership. Even Kim Jong-il, who was the least authoritative person in history, could connect some of that revolutionary energy. And so that's a really general thing about that particular landscape. But there are very specific elements in the landscape which are vital to North Korean history. So if you read the narratives of the fights and the various battles with Kim Il-sung and the guerrilla band, you will see that particular elements of topography, particular rocks and particular trees, become like supporting actors in the struggle. So particular trees become incredibly usefully placed for Kim Il-sung to hide behind, almost as if natural features and elements of that topography are in league with the communist guerrillas, in league with their sense of Korean nationalism. And a lot of those rocks and trees and pieces of topography are now part of the visitor sites in North Korean institutions. So children and civil servants from Pyongyang will travel to Paektusan to see particular rocks and particular trees and do particular tours of topographic features in order to connect with some of the authority and energy of the past. And my favorite ever example derives from a particular moment in 1936 when Kim Il-sung met Kim Jong-suk. It wasn't the first time that they'd met. It was the first time that Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-suk, his first wife and the mother of Kim Jong-il's relationship, was acknowledged publicly by the text. So apparently, Kim Jong-suk and a small band of female guerrillas are having a picnic by Lake Sanjeon, just south of the mountain, and it's a lovely sunny day. Who happens to arrive over the other side of the lake but Kim Il-sung and his band of guerrillas? Both guerrilla groups meet and they decide to have a joint picnic, and it's a really nice day. Everybody's having sort of a little bit of fun in between harassing the Japanese, apparently, and one of the female guerrillas says, wouldn't it be great to get a photograph of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-suk together? Because, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, everybody knows, there's a relationship going on, And Kim Jong-suk, as always, is extremely embarrassed, but Kim Il-sung says it's a great idea, And in the text, it says that Kim Jong-suk remembered that photograph as if it was her wedding photograph, which suggests that perhaps it was a sort of wedding photograph. And in that wedding photograph, the wedding photograph, the photographs you see are intriguingly designed, so it suspects they might be a little, if not pre-photoshopping, sort of like visual shenanigans. But the photograph has 3 birch trees behind them. So those 3 birch trees are now featured in all of the tour group studies around that site. Every year on the day of that supposed meeting and that photograph, they have a ceremony in front of the 3 birch trees to commemorate the meeting and the sort of, basically this is the when the dynasty began. Kim Jong-il came out of this relationship, and North Korea is born at this spot, really. And so these 3 birch trees, these 3 living things, which the birch trees now were supposed to be the same birch trees, but anyway, but those 3 birch trees are ciphers for all of the people who were there on that day, witnesses. Instead of human witnesses, they are living, non-sentient witnesses. And so that is really my favorite example of a natural piece of topography featuring in North Korean politics and history.
Your current work explores fishing, conservation and community in North Korea. And I'm particularly intrigued by the way you're moving beyond viewing fishing as just the commodified exploitation of sea creatures as inanimate resources, to see marine fauna as active agents themselves in this interplay between human coastal communities, political economy of the regions, and marine ecosystems. So can you say a bit more about this?
Well, it's actually really interesting how materials from North Korea really concern us. So primarily, the world is concerned with North Korean fissile materials and radioactive materials, technology metals, rare earth elements, and that sort of thing. So these materials are vital in geopolitics at the moment. And they have, in a sense, their own power. We fear the head of the missile firing into the Pacific, the terror of the prospect of these small pieces of ore hitting Seattle or something like that. So North Korean materials really concern us, and they have a real sense of agency themselves. Once someone's pressed the button, that inanimate object is a real actor in world politics, potentially. Sandra Fahy, the anthropologist at Sophia University, when I first started talking about this idea, raised that idea. So, in the sense that, all materials are equal, but some materials are more equal than others, And so we are really worried about those North Korean materials. But it's really interesting because in recent history in North Korea, we're really concerned about other North Korean materials too. So if we think about wheat or rice or meat, energy, protons, electrons in the North Korean context, we're really concerned about those in their absence. So in the early 1990s, there was a terrible famine period caused by the inability of North Koreans to use foreign capital anymore, or any capital, to buy food, and the collapse of their agricultural system. So agricultural products, inanimate and animate, I suppose, in terms of animals, became really active agents by their absence in North Korean society. Their absence created a famine, nearly the collapse of North Korea. The lack of energy, the lack of electricity, the force, thinking about electricity as an active agent, the lack of electricity available to North Korea's grid creates these elaborate photographs that you see from satellites, apparently, but they are nearly all composite images. But anyway, and that lack of energy as an active power has itself an active agency in geopolitics. The lack of energy suggests North Korea as a dark place, undeveloped, dark and evil. So the agency of those things I find really fascinating. And my thinking about this comes from political sciences, also in geography, as a notion of the new materialism. So originally inspired by people like Jane Bennett and Donna Haraway and Sarah Watmore, the geographer. Jane Bennett, I think she was at Duke University, theorized this notion of what you call thing power. Things that aren't alive or are alive in a different way from us have an agency in themselves, and they're actors in the world stage. And so I also think about it as Jason Moore, who is another political theorist, theorized this notion of the web of life, but he mainly theorized it from the capitalist web of life, in the sense that we imagine nature and the political economy and the social human society as totally extrinsic things, totally unconnected, totally different. But in reality, as we go into this understanding about human physiology, our bodies are enormous colonies of other living creatures. So our bodies are webs of life, of bacteria and viruses, and a lot of the way we are human is impossible without us being embedded within a wider web of life. And you can't extract that web of life from your own body, otherwise your digestive system wouldn't work. So neither in a capitalism can you extract nature from capitalism. So you get a sort of reflexive thing. So capitalism creates a nature, and nature creates a capitalism, because capitalism feeds off the products, the extraction and the accumulation of value from that, but also the ruins of capitalism, the sort of detritus that capitalism leaves behind, creates a new ecosystem for other things. So new species, rats or different species of plants. But what if you could have a non-capitalist web of life in North Korea? Although North Korea is awfully good at being capitalist at times. So theoretically it's a non-capitalist web of life in which it's impossible to extract, if you like, Juche principle or Songun or Byungjin or just simply North Korean historiography from nature, but also nature, as we've seen in these other aspects of North Korean historiography, helps create and co-produce North Korean history and North Korean terrain, the sort of terrain of revolutionary socialism, whatever that means. So, in a sense, there are players, we've seen the players by their absence, but what about the players by their presence? So, thinking about fish, so I think I'm working mainly about fish as active agents, in sort of North Korean politics, but you could equally think about timber, forests, disease, energy, the rare earth metals in the north, which could be worth a million, trillions of dollars if they actually exist, you know what I mean? Even I actually sort of thinking about the memory of North Korea. So, there are different forces in the world, all of whom are active agents, but also memory and potential memory of North Korea post-unification or post-whatever are also active agents in the present.
Yeah, well, let's have a look at that. So North Korea's seafood exports have become a sanctioned trade good earlier this year in UNSC Resolution 2371. So what's the significance of this particular inclusion in the sanctions regime, given what you've just been saying?
Yes, well, this is a classic example in which something we imagine is this sort of inanimate, neutral element of the world's ecosystem becomes a really active player in world politics and geopolitics. So fish become talked about in the United Nations Security Council. They become a weapon So the absence of fish and the absence of the capability to financialize fish resource become weaponized in the United States and other allied nations' sort of aggressive approach to North Korea. So Nikki Haley is suddenly interested in North Korean fish. She probably doesn't know the species, but North Korean fish are active in the American mind. In a sense, intriguingly, just as rare earth metals or radioactive materials are active in the American mind. Fish are a vital resource to North Korea. They were a vital resource to America in the 1950s and 60s when industrial fish production meant that you could basically turn fish into a stick, and create like industrial fish meal, which you could sprinkle in food and increase the nutritional values. So suddenly things that were useless nutritionally could actually be worth something. And so it became like a vital element of protein in the American industrial diet. Vital in the same way that it was vital to Japanese imperialism and the Japanese empire of the sea before 1945, and also vital to the post-war recovery of Japan. So the fish as a resource are hugely important to national development, and we've seen that even their absence has created political chaos in various places, such as the collapse of the Pacific salmon and the collapse of the cod stocks off the Grand Banks and the herring fisheries disappearing in the early 20th century in the UK. So the presence or absence of fish is vitally important for national development. For North Korea, the presence or absence of fish is vital for its capacity to feed what's left of its capacity to sort of support its national sensibility, and especially the army. Most people know that by this point, North Korea's public distribution system doesn't exist. So in the past, North Korea supplied people with rations according to their need, blah, 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 and according to also their role in society. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. It got to the stage where North Korea was supplying like 2 days out of the month and then no days out of the month. But it does try to supply, or it tries to make sure that the army is supplied, because the one functional institution in North Korea, apart from the central government and the Workers' Party of Korea, is the army, and sometimes it's difficult to tell. So it's important that the army is fed, and it's also important that the army has resource. And so one of the ways that the army has done that is by co-opting different developmental sectors. Not just because that's what happens, but also because it's good at it. In the past, and this is part of my research, North Korea's fishing industry was organized through a cooperative structure. So North Korea got expert fishermen from different places around the coast and gathered them together in fishing cooperatives and used fishing cooperatives of civilians to fish and extract fish from the sea. Now, in the last 10 to 20 years, North Korea has built a network of fishery stations, industrial processing and fishing plants and docks around the coast of the country that are run entirely by the army. And the army not only does all the fishing to supposedly supply the central stock of food in North Korea, but also as a sort of financial resource to sell. So one of the issues with the whole classic Jang Sung-taek, the execution of Jang Sung-taek, was that apparently Jang Sung-taek and his group had commandeered one of the contracts which exported fish by railway to China, away from the particular army unit that should have had that right. And so he was possibly executed in a sense because of his co-option of fishing rights, the rights to export fish. And so these current sanctions aim to impact not only North Korea's government's capacity to financialize their resources, but also as another way of restricting their army's capability and functionality, Whether this will actually be an achievable thing, whether it's actually achievable to restrict entirely North Korea's fishing capacity is another matter. For a start, the whole thing is predicated on North Korean fish actually arriving at ports and not being bulk loaded between ships in the middle of the sea. But, that's another story.
You and I have been corresponding for many years on climate change vulnerability in the DPRK and more broadly in Northeast Asia. From your research, what are the impacts of climate-related environmental change on communities in North Korea?
Well, my particular focus has been a fishing cooperative called Shindo, which is on an island in the estuary mouth of the Aonok Yalu River, just downstream from Dandong and Sinwiju. And it is a really important site, and the island is actually reclaimed from the sea. And one thing that my research in my doctorate told me was that North Korea has a real focus on reclaiming land from the sea, because what's even more revolutionary than reconfiguring a landscape to become a socialist landscape, but actually creating a whole new landscape that could be socialist revolutionary landscape. So North Korea is really concerned with reclamation of coastal land. But the one thing that North Korea is not actually very good at is maintaining that reclaimed land or finishing that reclaimed land. So they're nowhere near as good as the Dutch, for example. So reclamation projects tend to run out halfway through the process. They build the dikes and then they don't actually manage the landscape. So you get quite wet landscape, not very well developed land. And this is pretty much what happened in Shindo's situation, that this island was reclaimed from the sea quite badly. Unfortunately for them, due to climate change, both weather patterns around the mouth of the Yellow River have meant that you get a lot more storms blowing into the estuary and a lot more tidal surges, a lot more storm surges, and a general rise in sea level. So, unfortunately for this cooperative, as well as all of the developmental and sort of institutional problems, they are beset by sea level rise and essentially the sinking and the degradation and erosion of their own land. As climate change develops, this will be a fundamentally difficult challenge for North Korea to solve or to deal with, especially on the west coast, where the land is much lower into the sea. I mean, North Korea is not very resilient when it comes to climate change. I think we both know that. And the resilience and the ability to deal with the change in climate, the change in weather and sea level rise will be an extraordinary challenge to the North Korea of the 20 to 30 years hence, if it still exists. But, I mean, that's why North Korea is one of the reasons why North Korea is so concerned to connect with the we were so concerned to connect with the UNFCCC process and was involved in the Paris Agreement summits and that sort of things. Not saying that North Korea is the greatest participant in all of those summits, but it's there because it recognizes the global challenge of climate change, but it also is very useful in political terms because climate change is the Americans' fault. It's the non-socialist, non-revolutionary world's fault. Yeah, it's the fault of capitalists and it's the fault of capitalist industry. One of those other things in the web of politics and the web of ideology that North Korea can play in its combat of its enemies, I suppose. But it's also concretely a real issue for North Korea. All nations are challenged by climate change and sort of environmental crisis, but North Korea is one of the countries that has the least capacity to deal with it.
Robert Winstanley-Chesters, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.